Thanks everyone for being here. I'm a little nervous usually, only because this is the first time we're trying something new at NIE where we're trying to engage people and get different people from sort of, all over the place, okay, to bring something for us to learn, and hopefully that you will take something away from it as well. But if you see my title there, Creating Reading and Learning Spaces in Our School Libraries, essentially that is what our project is about. And we've only started the project. We started collecting the data this year in January. We did some pilots last year, but we really started collecting the data in January. And we started with this school first, and we're in the process of collecting the data from 5 other schools. This is a year-long project, so we'll be collecting data from the school over the course of an entire year to catch the patterns of what's happening in the school with regards to reading and learning. Okay, so anyway, the project is tied around three ideas. I mean, overall, we're looking at issues of space, okay, but I'm interested in space from 3 perspectives. The first is the idea of design. I think even as I was doing my project on reading, much earlier, one of the things I began to realize was that school libraries, as we know it, may not exactly be the best places for encouraging reading. And I wondered if the design and organization of the space was one of the things that contributed to students not wanting to come into the library. The second thing that I'm interested in is the idea of reading. How do we get our students to read? How do we motivate students to read, whether through the space of the library or through the kinds of practices we have in school? What kind of reading spaces can we design to encourage more reading, better reading, more critical reading? I think the third thing that I'm interested in is the issue of equity, which is the idea that, we want to make sure that our students, no matter where they come from, have equal access to reading, equal opportunities to getting books, equal opportunity to having models for learning how to read. And for today, I'm going to focus on the design aspect. We hope to have 3 roundtables, the first one on design, the second one on reading, and the third one on equity to generate more conversation. So the libraries that we're looking at today is really Commonwealth Library. I think Commonwealth Library is a good library to look at as an example, simply because it has been renovated with the idea of reading in mind. In our interviews with the head of department, the principal, as well as the library committee, what came across very clearly was that they wanted this space to be a space to promote reading. They wanted this space to be a space that students could study. They wanted this space to be a space where collaboration would happen. And that is how this space turned out. 3 questions we want to ask today. What in the Commonwealth space actually encourages reading? I mean, they've tried to build a space to encourage reading. So we're coming in to see, does this space actually encourage reading, and what kinds of reading does it encourage? And third question, how can we learn from this case study about school libraries and reading? We kind of think about students as problems, okay? In my work in schools, sometimes I hear, and this came from a principal said, the students don't come into the library, so we should just get rid of the library and use the space for something else. Or a teacher saying things like, well, the students just don't read, so there's no use trying to get them to read more. So very often the perspective that we take is that the student is the problem. We need to remedy the student to remedy the problem. But I think one of the things that we want to do in this project is to say the student's not the problem. Let's turn the question around and say, why would the students want to come into the library? What is so attractive about your library, about reading, that would make them want to come in? So rather than thinking about student as problem, we think about space as problem. As I mentioned just now, the Commonwealth space is good for 3 things, or at least intended to be good for studying, collaboration, and reading. Today's presentation focuses on the reading aspect of it. I think what is quite clear for those of you who have come in to look at the library is that this library is rather different in terms of the display of books from some of the other libraries you've seen. In most libraries, books are organized according to the Dewey Decimal System, which is alphabetically according to genre or type. One of the things that Commonwealth did was that they condemned a lot of their books which they felt were very old and not suited to students, and they curated a selection of books. So right now this library has less than 5,000 books. Okay, which works out quite badly in terms of library health, because if you're going by number of books per student to measure library health, this library only has 3 books per student, 3.5 books per student, which is a very low ratio. Okay, but what they've done to make up for the ratio is, in terms of the display, they've organized books by genre. So it's very easy to select the books. For example, there's a section on dystopia over there. The kids like to browse over there. There's a section called Easy Reads Horror. Books are displayed face up retail, taking the sort of retail notions into place to attract students to pick and browse. What is also different about this library compared to other school libraries is possibly the number of what DK type non-fiction that you have here, where it's not the kind of book that students want to borrow and bring home, but they are very browsable and they generate quite a lot of ideas. So remember just now I mentioned about library health being measured by number of books, so this is quite unhealthy by that measure. But what is interesting is that if you look at the year-on-year book loans, this is only the January data. So in 2015, the number of book loans in January was 142. The population here is about 1,200. 2016, 87. 2017, 483. It could, of course, be the presence of the library, and also there was orientation as well. So we can't tell for sure until we track it over the year. The other thing I think that is interesting to note is that this library actually occupies a prime space on the first floor between the foyer and the canteen. It has always been here, but it has, I think, traditionally not been well used despite its prime location. So we're trying to say that, hey, the space does make a difference, how the space has been done up. One of the interesting things that we're doing for this research is that we use time-lapse videos to capture what's going on. We have GoPros situated around places of interest, and every minute it takes a photo. This is that reading area over there. The beanbags are not normally there. We reconfigured the space a little bit for today, but the reading area as it is normally set up. And one of the things I thought when I came in was, I'm not sure if students are going to use that space because the chairs face each other. Okay, but maybe we just watch the video and get a sense of what's happening. Okay, if you look at this particular boy over here, he is a Sec 2 NA boy. He's one of the library regulars. I think one of the questions we have was, is it only the Express kids who are using the library? For those of you who are unfamiliar, the Express is sort of the regular 4-year track. The normal academic track students take 5 years to finish the course. So there tends to be an association with, say, the ones who take the longer track may not be readers. But what is interesting in our observations here is that we have observed that the normal academic students do come in. In this case, this boy is reading, and we corroborated with the data of our researcher being in here to observe it. And Agnes was observing him and talking to him. So he's reading Catcher in the Rye, which you think about it, for a Sec 2 boy is to pick up by himself, might be considered a difficult book. And he finishes it over the course of the week, and he comes in regularly and he borrows books. So we have some of these regulars who are here in the library. What is interesting also is that this space encourages different kinds of reading. So of course a sitting area, but there are different kinds of reading going on. There is what you call sustained reading, with that one boy who is actually sitting there and he's reading an entire book and finishing it. But there's also a lot of what I call book flipping, book browsing going on over there, where students pick up books close to them, there are interests. They sit there and then they read because the space is comfortable. It's close enough to what they have to sit down and read. Now, one of the things that is interesting about this space in terms of reading is that we wanted to ask, is the way that, is the arrangement something that's encouraging reading? I think it was quite clear that what the books do is that they do encourage some sort of browsing. Students come in, they know which shelves to head for, they go there and they get their books. What is interesting also is how students multitask, right? These boys, they are these little cubby holes and they're doing their work here. If you had a chance to look at the books, there are quite a lot of picture books in the library and pop-out books. And the students do pick them up a lot. And they actually use them to fill their time and to read, take a break from doing their work. So the presence of books means, and the presence of attractive books means that students can actually do that. It becomes a filler for them. Here you see a sense of reading as a social activity. It's not just an activity that's individual, done by one person. This is a more common image or idea. You know, when we think about reading, we think it must be sustained reading, where a student is sitting by herself or himself in a quiet corner and reading. But if you think about it, reading can be a very social activity. These are Sec 1 boys, I believe, reading comics. Okay, there's a great collection of comics in the library, but again, very well curated to ensure that they are good quality comics. So they're all sitting around, they're not talking to each other, but it's a social activity. Let's go to the library and read. Okay, and that's what they're doing. Here you see another example of what I call what the school has termed, I suppose, the multi-use of the space. The space was built for multiple uses. This is the stage area. We have seen classes being held here. We have seen presentations. The school has had musicians come in to perform and students sit on the different tiers to watch. But it's also colonized by students to read. And you know, this is on the laptop, and one of the things that we want to think about in terms of reading is that reading is not just about reading fiction. Reading is not just about reading, say, for pleasure, but here the students are doing work-related reading. Okay, they're doing research, and the library allows them to do that. They've taken up the laptop, loaned up the laptop from Madam Sue, and they're using it to do their research work. What is interesting also is that the school has things such as reading projects. So this school is interesting because they don't have a sustained silent reading period, which we have in many schools, but what they have are projects to encourage reading. And we see that happening, students coming in to do their work on reading. So what are the behaviors that we observe over 5 days? Now, one of the things that we do is during recesses and after schools, we sit down and every 10 minutes we do a count of who is in the library and who is doing what. During non-recess times, we take it every period, so we just do one count. So these are behaviors observed over 5 days. It's not the number of people in the library, but doing homework, 1,076 over 5 days. That's very common. If you go to all the school libraries, you'll find that studying and doing homework are probably the top reasons, followed by reading, discussion, browsing, chatting, consultation with teachers, handphones, then less so study revision, perhaps because this is not so close to the exams as well. Browsing on the internet. Usually when we say internet browsing, we mean they don't seem like they're doing school-related work, so we put that under leisure. Sketching, drawing, you know, doing their own thing. Hanging out, 3 students sleeping, okay? What we try to do is to categorize the behavior. So you can see in terms of study behaviors, we observe 1,000 counts, reading behaviors, 50%, collaborative behaviors, and then leisure behavior. I want to point out that this is interesting and that this is not necessarily, just because we have a certain space doesn't necessarily mean that certain types of behaviors will take place, because students colonize the place to do their own things. So it is interesting for us to see that leisure behavior at this point takes up very little time, okay? Because students multitask. In another library, what we observe, and this is an academic library which is linked to a JC as well, students tend to come in, they spend between a minute to 10 minutes on their devices before they plug into work. But ultimately, they come in to try to do their work, not to do something else. So is the library, school library, successful if we measure it by usage? I think in another project, earlier project that I did, one of the things we found out was that students don't really go to the school library. They go to the public library because the public library really has a lot to offer in terms of the kinds of books. But interestingly, over here at Commonwealth, you can see, if you look at the last 2 dots, that's for whole school, 79% of the 900-odd students who completed the survey reported that they go to the public library, and 71.6% report that they come here, which is a pretty high number. The other survey I did, it was sort of closer to 30-40%, and the school library would be irregular. The pattern for now, at least for term 1, is that the Sec 1s come in more. Top behavior for Sec 1s would be, the Sec 1s read more, the upper Sec study more, but we'll have more to report on it later. So what can we learn from our preliminary data from Commonwealth at least, and actually also from our observations across the different schools? I think one of the things that came across, one of the things that's important is what is the purpose of the space. When it comes to designing of spaces, it is important that the makers are clear about what they want the space to be designed for. That's at least the intent. Is the space meant for reading? Is the space meant for research? Is the space meant for studying? Is the space meant for performance, for printing? Is the space meant for students to use, in terms of policies like, do you want them to use their handphones, be able to do certain things in the library? I think, clarity in the purpose of the space seem to be a very important point. And then the second part is communication of that purpose to the students as well as the teachers. I think we don't want to forget that the teachers are a key component of the equation. I think the second thing that is important for us that we will be paying attention to as we are moving with the project is to think about how policy, practice, and program intersect. I mean, you can build a space here, but if you have a policy that doesn't encourage reading, students are likely to come in and colonize it for their own usage. For example, like I said, in another school, we have observed that there's a very lax handphone policy, which I don't think there's anything wrong with. It's just that the students are using the handphones in the library to watch videos and Korean dramas, actually. And then you ask yourself, do you want that to be the dominant use? I think it's all right. It could be the side use, but if that's the dominant use, are we communicating the policy about the library sufficiently? The second thing that's important is practice, how people are actually using the space, and to need to understand how students, how teachers utilize the space. And finally, it's the programs that are happening at schools. What kind of programs are there to encourage use of the library? What kinds of programs are there to encourage reading? So as we study space, we're not thinking about it in vacuum. We're trying to understand how it is one of the nodes that is important for our project. So with that, thank you.